Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents Mrs. Jeffries Takes the Stage by Emily Brightwell, narrated by Lindy Nettleton. Chapter 1.
"What's that blackguard doing here?"
Albert Parks muttered under his breath as he watched the small man in elegant black evening dress march down the centre aisle of the Hayden Theatre. Parks's heartbeat raced. Beads of sweat popped out on his forehead, and his hands started to shake. He dropped the velvet curtain, letting the material close so he wouldn't have to look at that hated face. What in the name of God was he going to do? The bastard wasn't even supposed to be in England. The last Parks had heard, Hinchley was in New York, savaging careers and giving the theatre people of London a well-earned rest from his vicious pen. Now, oblivious to the hustle and bustle going on around and behind him on the stage, Parks peeked through the curtain again. He spotted the critic taking a seat in the third-row centre. Damn! His eyes hadn't been playing tricks on him. It was Hinchley, all right.
"Mr. Parks,"
the wardrobe mistress called from the back of the stage.
"Mr. Swinton wants a word with you before the show starts."
Parks nodded dully and stepped away from the side curtain.
"All right, Agnes. Tell him I'll be right there."
He wondered if Tally Drummond still kept a bottle of whiskey in the bottom of the prop box. With Hinchley here, they'd probably all need a drink by the end of the evening. Trevor Remington, the leading man, saw Albert Parks wander off the stage. Parks's shoulders were slumped and his face was pale. Remington, always curious, dashed over to the spot Parks had just vacated and inched the curtain apart. The house was full. Remington couldn't see an empty seat. So what was wrong with dear old Albert? Fellow was a bit on the high-strung side, but then again, most good directors were, Remington thought. He started to step back when a man in the third row suddenly stood up. Remington's breath left him in a rush. His ears rang as he felt his face flush with remembered shame. What was he doing here? Remington leapt back from the curtain so fast he almost tripped over his feet. Dear God in heaven, what was he going to do? Ogden Hinchley was in the audience. Ogden the Ugly wasn't in America. He was sitting right out front. Swearing softly, Remington stalked off the stage, brushing rudely past Edmund Delaney without so much as a word. Edmund Delaney watched the actor stomp towards the back of the theatre. Must have a bad case of opening night nerves, Delaney thought, then dismissed the man in favour of curiosity. He stepped up to the curtain on stage left, pulled it apart and peeked out. He smiled. Not an empty seat in the house. Quickly he scanned the first few rows, wondering which critics had bothered to come. He hoped the Gazette and the Strand were here. Both papers were quite sympathetic to new playwrights. Then he spotted the man in the third row. Delaney stared hard for a few moments, hoping his eyes were playing tricks on him, but they weren't. The devil in the flesh. Delaney's hands clenched into fists. A red mist of rage floated in front of his face, and for a brief moment he thought he might be sick.
5 minutes, everyone!"
Delaney heard Eddie Garvey, the stage manager, call the warning. Delaney, his face set like a stone, turned and walked stiffly off the stage without so much as a glance at the stage manager or the wardrobe mistress. He was too sunk in his own misery to notice anyone.
"Well, what's got into him?"
Garvey asked. But Agnes had already hustled off to make sure the first scene changes were ready, so he ended up talking to himself. What's got into who? Willard Swinton, the owner of the Hayden Theatre, said from behind Garvey. Mr. Delaney. Garvey nodded toward the curtain. He was having a peek at the house, and then he walked off like he'd seen a ghost. Swinton, a balding man with a huge moustache and an infectious grin, laughed. He probably saw one of his former mistresses in the front row. No doubt that would give a man pause. Swinton wandered over to the curtain, eased it apart, and looked out. I wonder which of his former lovelies has turned up to torment the poor man. His voice trailed off as he saw a familiar figure sitting in the third row. Blast and thunder! He cursed softly under his breath. What did you say, Mr. Swinton? Garvey asked curiously. Who's out there? Swinton quickly dropped the curtain and leapt back. No one, he said hastily. No one at all. Go on, Garvey, get about your business. We've a play to put on, and I don't want any mistakes tonight. Yes, sir. Garvey hustled off. But he wondered just who was sitting out front. This was the fourth person now who'd looked like they'd seen the devil himself out front. The director, the playwright, the leading man, and now Mr. Swinton had turned pale as curdled milk when they'd peeked through that curtain. Eddie Garvey decided he'd take a gander himself as soon as he got Mr. Swinton out of his way. What time's the inspector's train due in? Asked Wiggins, the footman. He settled himself in his usual spot at the kitchen table and reached for one of the apple turnovers Mrs. Goodge had baked early that morning. Wiggins, with his round, innocent face, fair skin, and chestnut-brown hair that no amount of pomade could keep plastered to his head, was the youngest in the household of Inspector Gerald Witherspoon of Scotland Yard. 8:30, Smythe, the coachman, answered. But he said he'd take a hansom home. He doesn't want me to bother getting the carriage out to collect him from the station. Smythe was a big, muscular man with dark hair, heavy, almost brutal features, and brown eyes that generally twinkled with good humour. Unless, of course, he was annoyed, as he was now. He turned his head and frowned at Betsy, the pretty blonde maid. The lass could get his dander up quicker than anyone. But by the same token, one smile from her could brighten his whole day. But Betsy wasn't in the least intimidated by the coachman's glare. She knew him too well ever to be afraid of him. "It's no good you giving me those dark looks," she said tartly. "My mind's made up. Tomorrow I'm going to Whitechapel whether you or anyone else likes it." "Then I'm going with you," Smythe shot back. "I'll not have you over there on your own. It's too ruddy dangerous." "That woman was murdered in the middle of the night," Betsy said irritably. The last thing she wanted was Smythe tagging along with her. Not that she didn't like his company, she did. Lately they'd been keeping quite a bit of company together. But this time she had a special errand to do. She didn't want to be explaining herself to anyone else from the household. "I'm going to be there in broad daylight. Besides, murders happen all the time in the East End. I don't know why everyone's making such a fuss over this one." "'Cause this one's different," Wiggins chimed in. "This lady were out-and-out butchered. I know, I overheard Constable Barnes talking to Constable Griffith when they brought the inspector's reports round this morning." He was glad he'd had the good sense to dally about the hall when the constables had come by that morning. You could pick up quite a bit of news if you kept yourself quiet and took plenty of time polishing a banister. "What did he say?" Mrs. Goodge, the cook, asked eagerly. Wiggins' eyes grew as big as egg yolks. "Constable Barnes heard that the constable that found that woman's body was so sickened he lost his stomach. And it's not just one person that's been done in. According to today's Penny Illustrated, The police think there might have been 2 more ladies killed as well." "2 others?" Mrs. Goodge exclaimed. "What nonsense!" "It's what was in the paper," Wiggins argued. "Since when have you taken to reading that rubbish?" the cook scoffed. "Radical nonsense, if you ask me. And where did you get a copy? We don't have it here." "I buy it," Wiggins replied. "It's not radical, it just prints the truth. Not like the boring old Times. They don't even have pictures." "I like the illustrated too," Betsy said hastily. She'd much rather talk about newspapers than her proposed trip to the East End. "The drawings are ever so clever." "Going over to Whitechapel isn't being very clever," Smythe snapped. He wasn't about to be sidetracked by a discussion of the literary merits of London's daily newspapers. He narrowed his eyes and gave Betsy his most intimidating frown. It had no effect whatsoever. "You got an itch on your face?" Betsy asked bluntly, "or are you just glaring at me?" For a few moments they had a silent contest of wills. Smythe capitulated first. Though he was twice her size and outweighed her by 2 stone, he knew he was helpless against that stubborn set to her chin and that determined glint in her blue eyes. "You daft girl!" Smythe slumped back in his seat and looked at the woman sitting at the head of the table. Keeping Betsy safe was worth appealing to a higher authority. The housekeeper. "You tell her, Mrs. Jeffries. Tell her it's not safe to be running about that part of London now." Hepzibah Jeffries, a plump, middle-aged woman with dark auburn hair liberally streaked with grey, a kind face and sharp eyes that seemed to see everything, only smiled. She deliberately stayed out of this particular debate. Though she could see Smythe's point, she rather thought he was being a bit overprotective. Betsy had a right to both her privacy and her time. "It is Betsy's day out, Smythe," she said gently. "If she wishes to go to Whitechapel, it really isn't any of my concern. Though I do understand your trepidation, and to some extent I share it. This murder was particularly brutal. But I'm sure Betsy will be very careful." She smiled at the maid. "Won't you?" "Of course I'll be careful. I'm not stupid. I know there's a killer about," Betsy replied eagerly. "I'll not be gone long, just a couple of hours in the morning. Do you think the inspector will get that awful murder case?" "I sincerely hope not," Mrs. Jeffries said soberly. "But why don't you want him to get it?" Mrs. Goodge exclaimed. "We haven't had us a murder in months. I mean, it's not a very nice murder, but still, it's better than just sitting here doing nothing." Mrs. Jeffries tapped her finger against the handle of the teacup. She needed to explain things carefully. It wouldn't do to have the others thinking she didn't believe the inspector was capable of solving the crime. "I have an awful feeling about this one," Mrs. Jeffries replied slowly. "It's going to be very political. The Radicals won't hesitate to use the poor Nichols woman's murder for their own purposes. They want to call public attention to the conditions in the East End, and this murder is a good way of doing that." "And about time too," Betsy muttered. "I agree," Mrs. Jeffries said quickly. "It's shocking the way the government has conveniently ignored the plight of those poor unfortunates living in abject poverty and misery." "Then how come you don't want the inspector to get this one?" Wiggins asked. "A man as kind-hearted as our inspector would do his best to see this poor lady's killer brought to justice." To give herself a moment to think of exactly how to say what she thought ought to be said, Mrs. Jeffries reached for her teacup and took a sip. "Please don't misunderstand. You're right, Wiggins. Inspector Witherspoon would do his best. But I've a feeling in this case it wouldn't be enough. He's a wonderful man and an excellent detective, but in many ways he's very, very naive."
"Innocent-like,"
Smythe added with a nod. He understood what the housekeeper was saying. "This murder, with the radical press following it and using it, is going to be mired in politics from top to bottom," Mrs. Jeffries continued. "I'd hate to see the inspector subjected to that. He's far too honourable a person to know how to protect himself in those kinds of situations. They always get terribly complicated. Furthermore, it's not the kind of case he'd be much good at, I'm afraid." "Why not?" Betsy demanded. "He solved our last case all on his own." That was still a sore point with the staff, but in all honesty she had to give credit where credit was due. Mrs. Jeffries held up her hand. "Don't mistake my meaning, Betsy, but frankly, I'll be surprised if anyone solves this murder. There was something so savage, so awful about it, that I'd rather suspect the murderer is more like a mad dog than a human being. I've a feeling there won't be any clues or any connections or threads for the police to follow. It was an act of madness as well as murder." She shivered. "The inspector is well out of this one. It's fortunate that he had to pay a duty visit to his cousin. Otherwise, considering his record of success at the Yard, no doubt he'd have been dragged into it." "I don't reckon any of us could suss this one out," Wiggin said. "None of us would have the stomach for it." "Speak for yourself," Betsy said. "I'd like to get my hands on the animal that did it."
"That's why I don't want you anywhere near Whitechapel," Smythe exclaimed. "You don't need to be poking into this one, girl. It's too dangerous."
"I'm not going to be poking into anything," she snapped. "I've got a personal errand, but that don't mean I'd lose my stomach for catching the killer. Just because the Nichols woman was a prostitute don't mean she doesn't deserve justice."
"No one said that," Mrs. Jeffries said softly. "Of course she deserves justice. But Smythe is correct. Whoever killed that woman is dangerous, very dangerous. I hope none of us gets involved. Something like this could scar one for life."
"Seems to me that we're not likely to get involved in any murder," Mrs. Goodge snorted delicately. "Not with the way the inspector was carrying on before he left to visit that wretched cousin of his." Everyone stared at the cook in shocked silence. She'd said what all the others had been thinking but hadn't wanted to actually say. Mrs. Goodge folded her arms across her ample bosom. "Well, I'm right, aren't I? Just because Inspector Witherspoon solved that last case all on his own, he's been strutting about like the cock of the walk. It's not like him. Maybe the next time there's a murder, I'll just not help at all. Then see how he likes it." Mrs. Jeffries' heart sank. This situation had been brewing since June. Since Gerald Witherspoon had solved their last murder completely on his own. Oh, they'd helped, as they always did. But they'd been completely wrong. They hadn't even come close to figuring out who the real killer was. "I wouldn't say he's been strutting about," she said, "but I will admit he's been quite proud of himself, and justifiably so." I know," the cook waved her arms impatiently, "but if I have to listen to him go on and on about how he solved the whole thing from one little clue—" She broke off and sighed. "Well, it's enough to drive a person mad." "He does rather go on about it," Betsy agreed. "Of course he does," Mrs. Jeffries said. "He's very proud of that particular case. But it's not as if he realizes what he's doing. Remember, the inspector has no idea we've ever helped out on his investigations,
So it isn't as if he's loading it over us, Wiggins suggested. I read that in a book. Good, huh? Excellent, Wiggins. Mrs. Jeffries always took the time to encourage education. But she also wanted to get this problem aired out too. Furthermore, she continued, the inspector's behaviour hasn't been objectionable. She wasn't so sure that was a correct assessment at all. There'd been several times in the weeks following the last case in which she definitely heard a very patronising tone in his voice when she and the inspector were having one of their chats over a glass of sherry. But really, she mustn't be silly about it. Inspector Gerald Witherspoon was the best of men, truly one of nature's gentlemen. He'd spent years in the records room at the Yard. It was only after he had inherited his house and a fortune from his late Aunt Euphemia that his skills as a detective had really blossomed. Of course, the fact that he'd also hired Mrs. Jeffries had much to do with that blossoming. As a policeman's widow, Mrs. Jeffries had a keen interest in justice. She'd taken one look at the others in the household of Upper Edmonton Gardens and realized that all of them were intelligent, loyal, and utterly dedicated to Gerald Witherspoon. Naturally, they'd taken to helping him surreptitiously with his cases. They took great pains not to let him know they were helping him. "He's not been objectionable," Betsy agreed, "but I agree with Mrs. Goodge. He has been a bit full of himself. I'm not so sure I want to help him any more either. Not after all those nasty things he said about the idea of women police constables." "He were only saying he didn't think it was a safe thing for a woman to be doing," Smythe defended his employer. "Catching killers is dangerous work. He's a gentleman, is the inspector. Wouldn't want to see a woman in harm's way, that's all." "He was full of himself," Mrs. Goodge said firmly, "and whether he knows it or not, he needs us. But if he don't change his attitude a bit, the next time round, I just might tend to my cooking and leave him to it." 2 days later, Inspector Gerald Witherspoon came down the stairs and into the dining room. "Good morning, Mrs. Jeffries," he said brightly. "Is breakfast ready yet? I'm in a bit of a rush this morning." Mrs. Jeffries put the pot of tea she'd just brought up from the kitchen on the table. "Betsy's just bringing it, sir. Shall I pour your tea?" "Thank you." He sat down and laid his serviette on his lap. "That would be most kind." As she poured his tea, she could feel him watching her expectantly. Silently, Mrs. Jeffries sighed. She knew he wanted her to ask why he was in a rush this morning. But before she could get the question formed, Betsy, carrying a covered silver tray, came in with his breakfast. "Thank you, Betsy," Witherspoon said. "It's very good of you to be so prompt. I'm in a bit of a hurry this morning." "Something interesting going on at the Yard?" Mrs. Jeffries asked. She glanced at Betsy, who rolled her eyes heavenward. The staff already knew what was going on at the Yard. The inspector had told them at least a dozen times. "Why, yes, now that you ask." Witherspoon picked up his fork. "Ever since I solved that last murder, the chief inspector has kept me dreadfully busy. I've another one of those lectures to give this morning. You know what I mean. A group of police constables get bundled in, and I tell them about my methods." "Do you tell them about your inner voice, sir?" Betsy asked, her voice seemingly innocent. Mrs. Jeffries gave her a sharp look, but Witherspoon hadn't heard the laughter in the girl's tone. "Well, not precisely," the inspector said. "That's a difficult idea to get across." "Do you tell them about—" She broke off as they heard the pounding of the brass knocker. Betsy smiled apologetically and went to answer the front door. They heard voices in the hall, and a moment later Betsy came back
followed by a tall, grey-haired man in a police constable's uniform.
"Constable Barnes is here to see you, sir," she announced.
"Good morning, Inspector. Mrs. Jeffries?" Barnes smiled and took off his helmet. "Sorry to interrupt your breakfast, sir." "That's quite all right," Witherspoon said. "Do have a seat. Have you eaten?" "I've had breakfast, sir." Barnes pulled out the chair next to him and sat down. "But I wouldn't say no to a cup of tea." "I'm already pouring it, Constable." Mrs. Jeffries handed him a cup. "Tar." Barnes's craggy face relaxed a little as he took a long, slow sip. Then he put the cup down. "There's been a murder, sir." Betsy, who'd been on her way toward the door, stopped dead. Mrs. Jeffries sat down at the end of the table. "Oh, dear," Witherspoon replied. "Not another one of those poor women in Whitechapel, I hope." "No, sir, nothing as grisly as that," he grimaced. "But bad enough. This one's a man. They found him floating in the Regent's Canal late last night. Fully dressed, too. It looked like an accidental drowning, except that Dr. Bosworth happened to be at the mortuary when they brought the body in. Sharp fellow, that Bosworth. He noticed there was lavender soap under the victim's fingernails." "Lavender soap?" Witherspoon looked puzzled. "Yes, sir." Barnes took another sip of tea. "That got the doctor curious, so he had a good look at the man. There's indications he didn't drown in the canal at all. Bosworth thinks his head was held under in a bathtub. There's marks around the fellow's ankles." "Marks around the ankles?" the inspector repeated. "Gracious! How could that indicate someone had drowned in a bathtub?" As puzzled as the inspector, Barnes shrugged. "I don't know, sir. Dr. Bosworth said he'd explain it to you when you get to the mortuary." "Perhaps the marks were caused by the fall into the canal," Witherspoon suggested. He really didn't believe in going about looking for a murderer when there was a chance that the man's death had been accidental. "Bosworth doesn't think so." Witherspoon tapped his fingers against the tablecloth. He had a great deal of respect for Dr. Bosworth's opinion. "Has the victim been identified?" "That was the easy part, sir," Barnes grinned. "Dr. Potter identified him." "Potter?" Witherspoon's eyebrows rose. "But I thought you said that young Dr. Bosworth examined the corpse." "He did," Barnes chuckled. "But you know what an old busybody Potter is. He stuck his nose in to see what Bosworth was up to. Seems the victim was one of Potter's acquaintances. Fellow was a theatre critic. According to Potter, he's quite well known. Name of Hinchley, sir. Ogden Hinchley." "How dreadful," Witherspoon murmured. "Gave Potter a bit of a shock, sir, especially as Hinchley was supposed to be out of the country, not dead and floating in the Regent's Canal." "Did Bosworth have an estimate on how long the body's been in the canal?" "He said he'd know better after he'd finished the post-mortem, but his best guess is about 48 hours.
"How can you tell?" Betsy asked. "Oh, excuse me, sir." She smiled apologetically at her employer. "It's just, you know how we all like hearing about your cases."
"That's quite all right, Betsy." Witherspoon smiled kindly at the girl. He was such a lucky man. His staff was so very devoted. I'm curious myself. Barnes picked up his helmet. "I'm not sure. Potter asked the same thing. Bosworth said something about water temperature and fluid in the lungs, sir, and some new tests he'd read about. I really couldn't follow it all that well. Frankly, I don't think old Potter could either. But he pretended he knew what Bosworth was talking about. He didn't seem to believe it, though. You know how Potter is. Scoffs at anything he don't understand." He grinned again. Finally, after they'd argued for a few minutes, Potter stomped off in a huff. I told Bosworth to go ahead and do whatever tests he needed to do. I hope that's all right, sir.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?